In the middle of the 14th century, something invisible crept into Europe. It did not arrive with trumpets or banners, but hidden in the fur of rats and the bite of fleas. From crowded ports along the Mediterranean, it moved silently, spreading from town to town with terrifying speed. People called it the Great Pestilence, but today we know it as the Black Death. Within only a few short years, entire regions were emptied. Streets that once echoed with merchants and children's laughter became quiet, filled only with the sound of cartwheels carrying the dead. No army could stop it, no wall could keep it out, and no one who lived through it ever forgot how the world changed. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. In this episode, we'll slowly explore how the Black Death transformed medieval life, not just through tragedy, but through the deep and lasting changes it left behind. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can join us again for more calm journeys into the forgotten corners of history. Now, let us begin with the silent arrival of the plague. The Black Death did not come into medieval Europe with a roar of thunder or the clash of swords. It did not announce itself like an invading army, with banners unfurled and horns sounding through the valleys. Instead, it crept forward in silence, hidden in the smallest of creatures, moving across seas and land routes as if it were simply another companion to trade and travel. The arrival was so quiet, so ordinary at first, that no one could have guessed the enormity of the disaster that was unfolding. In the early 1300s, Europe was more connected to distant lands than it had ever been before. Merchants traveled to ports in the eastern Mediterranean, caravans stretched across Asia, and ships carried not only spices and silks, but also stories, news, and opportunities. A single vessel leaving the Black Sea could stop in Constantinople, Venice, Genoa, or Marseille, unloading cargo and passengers who had no idea that they were carrying more than goods. Hidden in the straw of grain sacks, in the corners of storage barrels, and in the fur of rats were fleas carrying a microscopic bacterium, Yersinia pestis. That invisible passenger would reshape the world. By 1346, rumors were already circulating of a strange sickness in far-off lands. Tales spread of sudden death in the east, of merchants collapsing without warning, of entire households gone within a few days. For most Europeans, these stories felt distant, almost like legends from another world. Life in a medieval town was already full of dangers: crop failure, hunger, bandit attacks, seasonal fevers. Another sickness was just one more shadow among many. Few paid serious attention. But as the years turned toward 1347, the shadow grew closer. It is believed that the plague entered Europe through the busy ports of the Mediterranean. Genoa's trading ships, returning from the Black Sea, became infamous in later accounts. Chroniclers wrote of ships drifting into harbor with half their crew dead, and the survivors too weak to stand. At Messina, in Sicily, townspeople saw these vessels arrive and were horrified to find sailors feverish, coughing, and covered in black swellings. The authorities tried to drive the ships away, ordering them back to sea, but it was already too late. Rats carrying fleas had already scurried down the ropes, slipping into the alleys and granaries of the town. The invisible invasion had begun. Life in Messina and other Mediterranean ports before the plague was busy and crowded. Narrow streets were filled with vendors, shouting traders, and animals wandering freely. Sanitation was poor. Waste was often thrown directly into the street. Water supplies were limited, and people lived tightly packed in wooden houses. These conditions were ideal for the spread of any disease. Though few realized it, a sailor, coughing in a tavern, a rat scurrying beneath a table, a flea biting its next host, each of these ordinary moments became part of a chain reaction that no one could see until it was too late. The first victims were often mistaken for ordinary fever cases. People fell ill with chills and weakness, which did not seem unusual. But within hours, the sickness revealed itself to be something far more terrible. Painful swellings appeared in the armpits, neck, and groin. These buboes grew large and blackened, giving the disease its later name, the Black Death. Many victims also coughed blood and suffered delirium, dying within just 2 or 3 days. Neighbors who had spoken with them in the morning found themselves attending their burial by evening. In those early weeks, fear spread faster than understanding. People whispered explanations that reflected their limited knowledge. Some believed the sickness came from foul air, rising from swamps, or carried on the wind. Others blamed outsiders or travelers, accusing strangers of poisoning wells. But no matter what people believed, the effect was the same: panic. Families closed their doors, refusing to help sick relatives. Markets emptied, taverns grew quiet, and the familiar bustle of town life gave way to a heavy silence, broken only by the tolling of bells for the dead. From Sicily, the plague moved swiftly. Ships carried it to Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. Each time, officials tried to resist, sometimes by banning ships from entering, other times by ordering quick burials. Yet trade was too vital to stop. Grain, wine, salt, and wool still needed to be transported. Merchants could not afford to lose their goods, and towns could not afford to lose their food. So ships docked, cargo was unloaded, and the plague spread inland. The silent arrival was most terrifying because it seemed to come from nowhere. A village might be untouched 1 week, then find itself struck down the next. Travelers and merchants carried the sickness along roads and rivers. Inns that once offered warmth to weary travelers became places of deadly contact. A single guest could arrive coughing, and within days, the innkeeper and his family would be gone. Villagers who welcomed caravans for trade soon found their generosity repaid with tragedy. Medieval chroniclers captured the shock of this suddenness. In one Italian city, a writer recorded how officials attempted to burn clothing and bedding of the sick, hoping to stop the contagion. In another, guards were placed at gates to keep strangers out. Yet the plague always seemed to slip past. A rat could cross a wall, a merchant might bribe a guard, or the disease could already be inside before anyone noticed. No barrier proved strong enough against something that no one could see. The silence of the arrival was not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. Streets that once rang with children's laughter or merchants calling out prices became empty. Bakeries closed, smiths left their forges cold, and courts stopped meeting. Bells tolled constantly, announcing death so frequent that townspeople could no longer keep track of who had passed. Graveyards filled quickly, and new pits had to be dug outside city walls. For many, the world seemed to have turned upside down in just a matter of weeks. And yet, during these early days, there was still disbelief. Many thought the sickness might pass quickly, like other illnesses had. Others believed that if they avoided strangers or stayed indoors, they would be safe. Some fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the crowded towns, but the plague was already everywhere. It clung to clothing, to goods, to the smallest movements of trade. The very connections that had made Europe prosperous now carried death to every corner. In the countryside, news of the plague arrived with fear before the disease itself. Farmers heard of cities emptied, of carts filled with corpses, of ports shut down. Rumors made the disease sound like a shadow creeping closer each day. Some villages prepared by storing food and closing their roads. Others prayed it would pass them by. Yet when it finally arrived, it did so with the same sudden swiftness fields left intended. Families gone within days, villages silent except for the caw of crows circling above. The arrival of the Black Death was not marked by one single event but by countless small tragedies repeating themselves across Europe. A sailor coughing in Messina, a merchant falling ill in Genoa, a mother locking her door in Venice, a farmer abandoning his plow in the fields outside Paris. Each moment seemed small on its own, but together they built a wave that swept across the continent. This was only the beginning. No one in 1347 could have predicted how deeply the plague would reshape the world, weakening the feudal system, transforming labor markets, changing attitudes toward life and death, and leaving a scar on culture that endured for centuries. But in those first months, the only certainty was fear, silence, and the sense that something unstoppable had entered their world. The silent arrival of the plague was over, and the age of devastation had begun. To understand the impact of the Black Death, it is important to first understand what life in Europe looked like in the years just before the plague arrived. The 14th century was a time of growth and strain, of ambition mixed with fragility. Medieval Europe was crowded, noisy, and busy, yet also deeply vulnerable to any disruption. The arrival of the plague was catastrophic in part because of the way people lived, worked, and interacted with each other in these years. Daily life in medieval towns was marked by closeness. Streets were narrow, often no more than alleys, twisting between wooden houses that leaned toward each other as they rose higher. These homes were cramped, sometimes shared by extended families, apprentices, and even animals. Windows were small, and ventilation was poor. In the evenings, smoke from hearth fires filled the rooms, while the smell of waste and refuse seeped in from the street. The crowded environment made any form of sickness easy to spread. A cough in one household could quickly become a cough in the entire neighborhood. Markets formed the beating heart of towns, every week, and often every day in larger cities. People gathered in central squares to buy and sell. Farmers brought in vegetables, bakers sold bread, butchers displayed cuts of meat, and traders offered cloth, spices, or wine. These markets were loud and full of smells, from the sweetness of fruit to the stench of fish left too long in the sun. People jostled, shoulder to shoulder, coins passed from hand to hand, and goods were exchanged with little thought to hygiene. Money itself carried filth, passing germs from one household to another, yet no one considered this. The focus was on trade, survival, and earning a living. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. In many towns, chamber pots were emptied directly into the street. Open ditches carried waste away, but often not far enough. Animals roamed freely, pigs rooting in refuse, chickens scattering across alleys, dogs scrounging for scraps. Rats thrived in this environment, finding easy shelter in the wooden beams of houses and a constant food supply in grain stores. No one thought of rats as carriers of danger. They were simply a part of everyday life, background creatures that shared the streets as much as humans did. In the countryside, life was different but equally vulnerable. Most of Europe's population lived in villages, working the land as peasants under the feudal system. Fields stretched out around wooden huts with thatched roofs. Families worked from dawn to dusk, plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Their diet was simple bread, porridge, and occasionally cheese or meat. Villages were smaller than towns, but still closely connected through social ties. News traveled quickly, and when sickness came, it did not take long to reach every household. Work rhythms were shaped by the seasons. In summer, the fields were full of laborers. In winter, life slowed, with families huddling indoors around the hearth. In both cases, people shared close quarters with relatives, neighbors, and livestock. Coughs, fevers, and minor illnesses passed easily from person to person. Few villages had doctors, and most relied on simple remedies made from herbs, or common practices like bleeding or purging. These treatments were often ineffective, but they gave people a sense of control in a world where life was fragile and uncertain. The population of Europe had been growing in the centuries before the plague. Towns expanded, trade flourished, and new farmland was cleared to feed the rising numbers. But this growth had also brought strain. Famines in the early 1300s had revealed how close to the edge many communities lived. A poor harvest could mean hunger for thousands. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making people more susceptible to sickness. Even before the Black Death, Europe was not a healthy place. Average life expectancy was short, and infant mortality was high. Death was a familiar presence. Still, people adapted to these conditions and found ways to live with them. Festivals, fairs, and markets brought color and energy to the year. Families gathered for meals, guilds organized feasts, and music filled the air on holidays. Life may have been harsh, but it was also full of rhythms and traditions that gave meaning and structure. This balance, however, was delicate. The crowded streets, poor sanitation, reliance on trade, and weakened health all created the perfect conditions for disaster. The plague entered a world already primed for crisis. Towns and villages were like dry wood waiting for a spark. Once the spark came, it spread rapidly, feeding on the very closeness that made medieval life vibrant. The same markets that connected people to food and goods also connected them to disease. The same narrow streets that created a sense of community also trapped sickness. The same houses that sheltered families also held the air of infection. It is important to remember that medieval people did not understand germs or bacteria. The idea that tiny organisms cause disease was centuries away. Illness was explained through concepts like bad air, imbalances of the body's humors, or the influence of distant stars. When people became sick, they searched for explanations that fit within their worldview, sometimes blaming outsiders, sometimes seeking hidden signs. This lack of understanding meant that daily practices carried on as usual even as danger grew. People crowded markets, gathered at inns, and traveled along roads, unaware that their ordinary habits were helping spread a catastrophe. Medieval life before the plague was therefore a mix of resilience and fragility. People were accustomed to hardship, but they had no defense against what was coming. Their homes, their towns, their systems of work and trade all were vulnerable. The silence before the storm was filled with the noise of ordinary life. Merchants shouting in the square, children playing in the mud, farmers calling across fields, bells ringing from towers. Within just a few years, many of those same voices would be gone, and the sounds of life replaced with the silence of death. The arrival of the plague did not create Europe's weaknesses. It exposed them. The closeness of towns, the dependence on trade, the poor sanitation, and the already strained health of the population, all of these combined to make the Black Death so devastating. Without understanding it, medieval people had built a world where sickness could thrive, And when the sickness came, it moved through their lives with terrifying speed. This is the world that existed just before the Black Death, a Europe alive with trade and energy, yet deeply vulnerable, a society crowded and full of connections, yet unable to see the danger those connections carried. It was a world where people went about their daily lives, never suspecting that in only a short time those same streets, fields, and markets would be emptied. The plague was still only a whisper on the horizon, but Europe's way of life had already prepared the stage for what was to come. When the plague first settled into Europe, the most striking feature was how fast fear spread. Panic in some ways traveled even more quickly than the disease itself. In the months after the first ships reached Sicily and Italian ports in 1347, news moved from town to town carried by merchants, sailors, and rumors whispered in markets. People heard of sudden deaths, of entire households gone in days, and of streets lined with abandoned bodies. At first, many did not believe it. Disease was common in the Middle Ages, and life had always been fragile. But as the weeks turned into months, denial gave way to a rising wave of panic that shaped the behavior of whole communities. The first stage of panic was disbelief mixed with curiosity. In Messina, Genoa, and Venice, townspeople gathered to look at the sick sailors or hear reports from neighbors. They were horrified, but also fascinated by the strange new illness. People asked questions in the marketplace. How could men so strong fall so quickly? Why were their bodies covered in dark swellings? Was it a curse, bad air, or something carried by strangers? The lack of answers made the situation more frightening. When explanations failed, fear filled the gap. Soon, panic became visible in the streets. Families who had lived side by side for years now avoided one another. Neighbors who once shared bread and news across a fence suddenly closed their doors. Shops shuttered, markets grew quiet, and taverns emptied. Authorities tried to impose order by limiting gatherings or controlling entry into towns, but their measures came too late. The disease was already inside, and panic was becoming part of daily life. Carts carrying the dead became a common sight in many towns. At first, they moved quietly, picking up bodies from a household here and there, but within weeks, they were moving constantly day and night. People began to recognize the sound of wheels on cobblestones as a signal of death's arrival. Bells rang so frequently that townspeople lost track of whether they marked a single death or dozens. This constant reminder fed panic further. Life no longer felt secure, and every cough or shiver seemed like the start of doom. As panic grew, social bonds weakened. Chroniclers wrote of parents leaving children, of siblings refusing to care for one another, of spouses turning away from the sick. While these accounts may be exaggerated at times, they capture the essence of the panic. Fear was stronger than love in many moments. People believed that contact with the sick meant certain death, and so they withdrew, even from those closest to them. The household, once the center of medieval life, became a place of suspicion and dread. Villages and towns tried different measures to control the spread. Some attempted to quarantine households by locking them inside their homes. Guards stood at doors, ensuring no one entered or left. In some cases, entire neighborhoods were sealed off. These efforts often created more panic, as people realized that being confined with the sick meant waiting for death. In other towns, outsiders and travelers were blamed. Strangers arriving in villages were met with hostility, suspicion, and sometimes violence. Fear of contagion made every new face a potential threat. Markets, the lifeblood of towns, were especially affected, where once there had been shouting vendors and bustling trade. There was now silence. People avoided crowded spaces, and sellers struggled to find customers. Grain, meat, and vegetables piled up and sold, while others went without food because they feared contact. Inns and taverns also suffered. Travelers found it difficult to find lodging, as innkeepers refused to accept guests. Panic did not only isolate households, it also isolated entire towns, cutting off trade and communication. In the countryside, panic took a different form. Villages often relied on news from passing merchants or messengers, and these stories spread fear before the disease itself arrived. Farmers began avoiding nearby towns, choosing instead to stay in their fields. Some villages blocked roads with logs or stones, hoping to keep travelers away. Others placed guards at crossroads. These defenses rarely worked, but they reflected the depth of the fear. The countryside, usually more isolated, became a place of suspicion as much as the crowded towns. Medieval chroniclers recorded vivid scenes of panic. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio described how people avoided even touching clothes or objects handled by the sick. He wrote that entire neighborhoods fell silent, and that fear spread faster than trust. In Siena, Agnolo di Tura recorded that families no longer buried their dead with dignity, but instead piled bodies in pits, too frightened to linger. The sheer scale of death overwhelmed ordinary customs, and the abandonment of rituals added to the sense of chaos. One of the most telling signs of panic was the flight of the wealthy. Nobles, merchants, and officials who had the means to escape often fled cities for the countryside. They hoped that by isolating themselves in villas or rural estates, they could avoid contact with the sick. Their departure, however, left towns without leadership. Local officials, priests, and merchants who might have organized relief were gone, leaving ordinary citizens to fend for themselves. This absence of order deepened the sense of panic, as people realized that even the most powerful were afraid. Panic also reshaped behavior in smaller, quieter ways. People carried herbs or flowers, believing that strong smells might protect them from foul air. Some avoided touching money, fearing it carried contagion. Others refused to share meals or drink from common cups. Everyday gestures of hospitality, offering bread, shaking hands, or sharing a drink suddenly became sources of danger. The routines of daily life, built on trust and contact, collapsed under the weight of fear. In many places, panic created divisions between groups. Outsiders were blamed, and rumors circulated of travelers, beggars, or even merchants deliberately spreading the disease, while no one understood bacteria or fleas. The human impulse to find someone to blame was strong. This further fractured communities already strained by sickness. In some towns, panic even turned violent, as mobs attacked strangers accused of bringing the plague. The search for safety turned into a search for scapegoats, intensifying the chaos. At the same time, panic did not always lead to violence. For many, it led to withdrawal and isolation. People shut themselves indoors, refusing contact with neighbors. Streets once crowded with life became empty, filled only with the sound of distant wheels carrying bodies. Silence itself became a mark of panic. The absence of voices, laughter, and bargaining in markets told people that fear had taken hold. The first panic was perhaps the most intense because it was mixed with uncertainty. Later, in the plague years, people became grimly accustomed to death. But in these first outbreaks, There was only confusion. No one knew how long it would last, who would be taken, or whether safety could be found. The invisible nature of the disease meant that every cough, every stranger, and even every object carried suspicion. This constant uncertainty fed a panic that felt inescapable. As 1347 turned to 1348, panic spread with the plague across Europe. It was visible in every shuttered window, every empty market, every abandoned street. It reshaped human behavior at every level, from families to whole towns. What had once been communities bound by trust and custom were now fragmented by fear. And though the plague would bring many lasting changes, this first wave of panic revealed how fragile medieval society could be when confronted with the unknown. The panic did not stop the disease. It did not protect families, villages, or towns, but it did show how deeply fear could cut into the structures of daily life. The Black Death was not only a biological disaster, it was a social and psychological one. And in those first months of arrival, panic became as much a part of the story as the sickness itself. By the time the plague had firmly established itself across Europe, daily life no longer resembled the world people had once known. Ordinary rhythms, work in the fields, trade in the markets, laughter in taverns continued in fragments, but all of them took place beneath the heavy shadow of death. For many, every action, no matter how small, was tinged with fear. Even the most routine parts of medieval life, buying bread, fetching water, tending animals, were shaped by the awareness that sickness might be lurking nearby. Markets under fear, markets, which had once been the center of community life, became uneasy places. Some vendors continued to set up their stalls, but fewer customers came. Where once the air had been filled with shouting and bargaining, silence often hung over the square. Buyers kept their distance, eyeing both the goods and the seller with suspicion. Was the bread touched by a sick hand? Was the cloth brought in by a traveler carrying disease? The lively exchanges of medieval commerce gave way to quick, cautious transactions. Money passed from hand to hand reluctantly, as though it carried danger along with its weight. Food supplies also grew unstable. Farmers sometimes avoided towns, fearing infection, and merchants abandoned trade routes. In cities, this meant shortages. Bread became more expensive, meat scarcer, and many households turned to whatever they could find or grow themselves. For the poor, whose diets were already fragile, this meant hunger alongside fear. A trip to the market, once a mundane necessity, became an anxious gamble, essential for survival, yet full of hidden risks. Work and abandonment work also shifted dramatically. In some towns, tradesmen abandoned their shops altogether. The smith's forge went cold, the tailor's bench stood empty, and the baker's oven no longer glowed with heat. Panic, death, and the flight of workers all contributed to this disruption. Those who continued working often did so with fewer customers. Taverns and inns, once lively with conversation, now echoed with silence. Travelers could not be trusted, and locals preferred to stay home. In the countryside, fields sometimes stood untended. When a family fell ill, their plow was left idle, their crops neglected. Villages that lost many of their workers could not manage the demands of the harvest. In some cases, grain rotted in the fields or hay was left uncut because there were not enough hands to gather it. This neglect of the land deepened the food shortages that already strained communities. Family life in close quarters inside homes. Life was quieter but no less tense. Families huddled together, sharing cramped spaces with little chance of escape from one another. The fear of sickness often mingled with the necessity of care. Parents watched their children anxiously, worrying at every sign of cough or fever. The sick were tended with hesitation, as family members balanced love with dread of catching the illness themselves. Some households tried to isolate the ill in separate rooms, but medieval houses were too small for true separation. In many cases, once one person was sick, the rest followed. At night, fear was amplified. Darkness closed in, and the absence of noise in the streets reminded people of how much life had already disappeared. Families whispered about neighbors who had died, about carts that had come to collect bodies, about whether they too would survive. Until morning, sleep, when it came, was restless, filled with the weight of uncertainty. The soundscape of death, one of the most haunting features of daily life, was the constant presence of death itself. The sound of bells tolled relentlessly, marking funeral after funeral. In towns, the creak of death carts became part of the daily rhythm. People could hear the wheels rolling over cobblestones, the voices of men calling out for the dead, and the thud of bodies being lifted into wagons. Even those who remained healthy could not escape these reminders. The background of ordinary life was replaced with the soundscape of loss, silence, and abandonment. Silence, too, became a powerful presence. Streets that had once echoed with laughter, bargaining, and gossip now often lay empty. Instead, quiet, schools closed, and even churches once filled with song and prayer grew eerily still. The silence was not peaceful but heavy, the silence of absence. People avoided one another, shutting themselves in their homes. For those who dared to walk outside, the emptiness itself was frightening. An abandoned street was a sign that death had already passed through, leaving nothing but quiet behind. Attempts at normal sides like this, many tried to hold onto fragments of normal life. Farmers still went to their fields if they could. Bakers still lit their ovens, and some markets continued to open. Children played in the streets in villages less affected, though their laughter was more cautious than before. Human beings are resilient, and even in times of fear, daily routines persisted. But every act of normalcy was overshadowed by the awareness of the plague. A woman kneading dough might wonder if the flour had been touched by a sick merchant. A man tending his sheep might wonder if the neighbor who borrowed tools had fallen ill. A child chasing a ball through the street might glance nervously at the closed doors of houses where whole family ease had vanished. Normal activities carried a weight they had never carried before. The burden of burial, one of the most difficult tasks of daily life, was the burial of the dead. Families who lost loved ones struggled not only with grief, but with the practical need to dispose of bodies. In towns, burial pits became common, and officials organized collections of the dead. But in villages, the responsibility often fell to neighbors or relatives. Graves were dug quickly, sometimes without ceremony. This too reshaped daily life, as men who once spent their days in the fields now found themselves digging pits, carrying bodies, and trying to keep pace with the relentless demand. Travel and isolation was deeply disrupted. Roads that had once been filled with merchants and pilgrims now grew empty. Villages blocked their entrances, towns shut their gates, and inns turned away strangers. Those who had to travel often found themselves unwelcome, suspected of carrying the plague. This isolation cut off trade, but it also cut off the flow of news. Rumors replaced reliable information, and uncertainty grew. People did not know where the plague would strike next or how far it had spread. This lack of knowledge deepened the sense of living in a shadow, never sure when or where danger might appear. Fear in small gestures. Daily life under the plague was defined by fear hidden in small gestures. People avoided touching doorknobs, passing cups, or shaking hands. They stepped aside when others passed in the street, or they crossed to the opposite side entirely. These actions, repeated again and again, reshaped social interactions. Medieval life had always been communal, but the plague made it cautious and distant. Children, too, lived in this shadow. They overheard whispers, saw neighbors vanish, and noticed the fear etched on their parents' faces. Many grew up without siblings, parents, or whole families. Plague continued in some places. But even games were changed by the absence of friends and the constant reminders of death. For children, the shadow of the plague would linger long after the disease itself had passed. The weight of time, perhaps the most defining feature of daily life during the plague, was the weight of time itself. Days stretched endlessly, filled with uncertainty. People waited for the sickness to appear in their homes, waited for carts to come, waited for the tolling of bells. The future felt suspended, replaced by a constant focus on the present moment. Would the cough become worse? Would the neighbor survive the night? Would food last through the week? The plague turned time into a heavy burden, pressing down on every household. The shadow's reach. What made this shadow so powerful was its universality. No household, no village, no town was untouched by its presence. Even those who remained healthy lived under its weight. Every sound outside the door, every absence at the market, every shuttered window reminded people that death was near. The plague was not only a sickness, but a presence that shaped every detail of life. The Black Death did not only take lives, it dismantled the very structures that held medieval communities together. Villages, towns, and cities across Europe found themselves unraveling under the strain of constant death, fear, and abandonment. What once bound people in cooperation and social trust now came undone, replaced by suspicion, silence, and isolation. To understand how devastating the plague was, one must see how entire communities built over centuries crumbled in just a few short years. At the heart of every medieval community was the idea of togetherness. Villages functioned through cooperation, neighbors helping one another with harvests, families sharing tools, and whole settlements gathering for festivals or markets. Towns thrived on trade and exchange, on the bustle of streets and the mingling of merchants and customers. But the plague destroyed this closeness. Fear of contagion turned cooperation into avoidance, and avoidance into hostility. Neighbors who once shared bread now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Travelers who once brought news and goods were suddenly seen as potential carriers of doom. The same ties that had made communities strong became the very channels through which suspicion spread. Markets, once the central gathering place, were often the first to falter. As the disease advanced, fewer people dared to gather in the squares. Stalls were abandoned, voices fell silent, and the lively exchange of goods was replaced with a hollow emptiness. The collapse of markets meant more than the loss of trade. It meant the collapse of the communal heart of the town. Without the daily rhythm of meeting, bargaining, and gossiping, communities lost the glue that had held them together. The very act of exchange had bound people into networks of trust, and when that stopped, so too did the sense of belonging. The same was true in villages. Traditionally, rural life depended on cooperation, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Families alone could not always manage the heavy labor required, so neighbors helped one another. Yet when the plague came, many fields were left untended. The fear of visiting another household, The sudden deaths of laborers and the constant uncertainty all meant that crops rotted where they grew. The bonds of trust that had once ensured survival were severed. Villages that had once celebrated together at harvest festivals found themselves divided, each household locked in isolation. Perhaps the most painful collapse came within families themselves. Chroniclers of the time describe how even the closest ties often broke under the strain of fear. Parents abandoned children, children fled from sick parents, and spouses left one another to face death alone. While not every family dissolved in this way, enough did that the memory lingered for generations. The household, once the primary unit of medieval life, was no longer a sanctuary. Instead, it became a place of suspicion, where every cough or shiver carried the weight of dread. The loss of trust inside homes reflected the greater unraveling of trust across society. Another factor in the collapse of communities was the loss of leadership. In towns, officials, merchants, and wealthy citizens often fled to the countryside at the first sign of plague. They sought safety in isolation, leaving behind ordinary people to face the crisis without guidance. Local governance crumbled. There were fewer constables to enforce order, fewer judges to settle disputes, fewer merchants to stabilize trade. In villages, the death of local lords or stewards left peasants uncertain about rents, obligations, and rights. Without leadership, communities drifted, unsure how to organize themselves in the face of disaster. This absence of authority also meant that fear found no outlet in order. Rumors spread unchecked, and suspicions hardened into hostility. Outsiders, beggars, and travelers were often blamed. Communities turned inward, sometimes violently, against those they perceived as threats. In some places, mobs attacked strangers or accused individuals of deliberately spreading disease. Fear of contagion, combined with fear of betrayal, and communities fractured under the weight of suspicion. What had once been a shared fight for survival turned into a desperate effort to protect one's own household, often at the expense of the wider group. Burial practices reveal another layer of collapse. In normal times, communities took pride in burying their dead with dignity, gathering together to mourn and remember. During the plague, however, this tradition broke down. Bodies were often left in homes until carts came, or they were piled into mass graves without ceremony. Neighbors, who once would have helped dig a grave or carry a coffin, now refused, fearing the touch of the corpse. The collapse of burial customs did not just represent a practical problem, it represented a spiritual and social one. Communities lost their rituals of mourning, and with them, part of their shared identity. The absence of funerals and ceremonies deepened the sense of isolation, as people grieved alone, without the comfort of neighbors or friends. In towns, silence replaced the usual sounds of community life. Where once there had been bells for weddings, festivals, and gatherings, now there were only bells for the dead. Streets that had echoed with voices and footsteps now lay empty, punctuated only by the creak of death carts. Inns closed, schools shut their doors, and workshops stood idle. The absence of daily interactions was more than inconvenient. It hollowed out the social fabric. A community is not only defined by its people but by the constant small exchanges that give it. Texture greetings in the street, conversations in the market, help offered in times of need. When these disappeared, the idea of community itself began to unravel. In villages, the abandonment was often physical as well as social. Families fled their homes, hoping to escape to other regions. Some villages emptied entirely, leaving behind only deserted houses and overgrown fields. Travelers later described walking through landscapes dotted with silent, abandoned settlements. These ghost villages were stark reminders of how completely the plague could erase a community. A place that had once been full of life, with smoke rising from chimneys and children playing in the fields, could in a matter of weeks fall into silence and ruin. The collapse of communities also had lasting economic effects. With so many dead, labor became scarce, fields lay fallow, workshops closed, and trade networks weakened. Survivors sometimes moved to other towns or villages, seeking better opportunities, further dispersing what remained of their original communities. The old patterns of loyalty and obligation, built up over generations, were disrupted. Communities no longer held together in the same way. The feudal bonds that had tied peasants to their lords, merchants to their towns, and artisans to their guilds loosened under the strain. The plague shook the very structures of medieval society, and communities, once thought immovable, crumbled. It is striking how quickly the collapse occurred. Centuries of tradition and structure could not withstand the pressure of a few years of death and fear. What people had taken for granted, the closeness of neighbors, the support of community, the rituals of life and death, vanished in the face of the plague. In its place came suspicion, abandonment, and silence. The collapse of communities was not only a symptom of the plague's devastation, but also one of its most lasting legacies. The memory of how quickly trust and structure could dissolve lingered for generations, shaping how people thought about society itself. Daily life in the shadow of the Black Death was therefore not just about survival, but about the erosion of connection. Communities that had once seemed permanent revealed themselves to be fragile. The networks of trust, trade, and cooperation that held people together could not withstand the weight of constant fear and relentless loss. The collapse of communities was as much a part of the plague's story as the deaths it caused, showing how deeply a society can be reshaped by disaster. As the plague swept across Europe, its most haunting effect was not only the countless lives it ended, but also the way it emptied towns and villages, leaving behind hollow shells of once thriving communities. The abandonment of settlements was not a single dramatic act, but a slow unraveling, a process in which daily life grew thinner and thinner until eventually whole places fell silent. This gradual disappearance reshaped the medieval landscape, creating ghost towns and villages where only memories and ruins remained. In towns, the first signs of abandonment appeared in the streets. At the start, a few shops would close their shutters, perhaps because the owner had died, perhaps because fear had driven the family to flee. Then inns would grow quiet, no longer welcoming travelers who themselves had become rare. Markets, once bustling with energy, dwindled to a handful of sellers and weary customers. Each missing sound and absent face was noticed. Communities were highly attuned to the rhythms of life, and when those rhythms faltered, people understood that something was deeply wrong. Soon, whole streets stood deserted, with doors locked and windows boarded. It was not only sickness that emptied towns, but also the fear of waiting for death behind those doors. For those who could afford to leave, flight seemed the only option. Wealthier families fled the towns at the first whisper of the plague, retreating to country estates or remote cottages in the hope that distance would protect them. This exodus stripped towns of their leadership and of the individuals who often provided structure. Merchants, officials, and tradesmen. Ordinary townspeople noticed these absences keenly. When the men and women who were expected to guide and protect abandoned their responsibilities, Others followed, confidence in the strength of the town dissolved, and households began to consider escape as their only choice. In the countryside, abandonment took different forms. Villages were smaller, their populations more tightly bound to the land, yet even here people fled. Sometimes whole families vanished in the night, leaving their cottages unlocked, their hearths cold, and their livestock untended. Passing travelers described villages where animals roamed freely, chickens scratching in empty yards, and cows wandering unmilked in the fields. Crops grew wild, untended, until weeds overtook them. What had once been the rhythm of sowing and reaping gave way to silence and overgrowth. The landscape itself began to testify to the absence of people. The decision to abandon a town or village was not taken lightly. For most medieval people, place meant survival. The town walls, the village commons, the fields and barns all were bound to life itself. To leave meant risking starvation, vulnerability, and disconnection. Yet when the plague reached its height, the dread of staying often outweighed the dangers of leaving. People weighed the familiar safety of their homes against the unknown of the road, and many chose the road. Travelers told of walking through silent towns where only a few figures remained. Streets littered with refuse, abandoned tools, and broken carts showed how quickly life had been disrupted. In some places, dogs and pigs rummaged through the debris, unchecked by human order. Wells grew stagnant, fountains dried, and gardens turned wild. The absence of people was not quiet and clean, but chaotic, marked by decay and neglect. These abandoned towns bore the scars of sudden disruption, as though life had been interrupted mid-step. Abandonment was not always total, however. In many towns and villages, a remnant population stayed behind, too poor, too fearful of the unknown, or too stubborn to leave. These individuals lived among the ruins of their own communities, carrying on as best they could. They scavenged from empty houses, tended the fields left behind by others, and tried to maintain some semblance of order. Yet their presence only highlighted the emptiness around them. A handful of people scattered through a town built for thousands created an eerie contrast, a reminder of the scale of what had been lost. The psychological weight of abandonment was immense. For those who fled, the sight of deserted homes and empty streets lingered in memory, a constant reminder of how fragile their world had become. For those who stayed, the silence pressed down heavily. Every creak of a door, every echo of footsteps in an empty street reminded them of the absence of neighbors, friends, and kin. The sense of community, already strained, finally dissolved when whole places emptied out. People no longer thought of themselves as part of a living network. They saw themselves as isolated survivors. The economic impact was just as severe. Abandoned villages meant uncultivated fields, lost harvests, and hunger that spread even where the plague had not yet arrived. Abandoned towns meant broken trade routes, lost crafts, and the collapse of local markets. Goods that had once flowed freely along roads and rivers now piled up and sold or never reached their destinations. Merchants avoided abandoned regions, fearing both plague and robbery, for deserted roads were unsafe. Isolation fed upon itself, and the more places were abandoned, the more others considered leaving too. Chroniclers left vivid descriptions of this emptiness. Some wrote of entire villages where no smoke rose from chimneys, where doors banged in the wind, and where fields were dotted with weeds instead of workers. Others described cities where grass began to sprout between cobblestones and where birds nested in the roofs of empty houses. The image of nature reclaiming human spaces was powerful, and it remained etched in the memory of survivors. To them, it felt as if the world itself was erasing human presence. In many regions, the abandonment was permanent. Whole villages disappeared from records, never to be reoccupied. Sometimes survivors from nearby towns would strip these places for materials, carrying away timber and stone to build elsewhere. At other times, the land simply returned to forest and meadow. Archaeologists centuries later would find these ghost villages, their outlines faint but still visible in the earth. They were the silent monuments of the plague's disruption. For towns, abandonment sometimes meant decline rather than total disappearance. A thriving city might shrink to half its size, with entire neighborhoods left deserted while survivors crowded into the center. The once bustling outskirts became zones of silence, gradually falling into ruin. The memory of these empty quarters lingered for generations, a constant reminder that prosperity could vanish overnight. The abandonment of towns and villages also reshaped social relationships. Survivors who fled often settled in new places, bringing their customs, accents, and needs with them. Communities absorbed these newcomers uneasily, for strangers were still feared as potential carriers. Yet necessity sometimes overcame suspicion. Villages in need of labor welcomed new families, while towns in need of merchants tolerated outsiders. The reshuffling of populations created new patterns of community, but always under the shadow of the memory of those places left behind. The plague revealed that human settlement, which had seemed so permanent, was in fact fragile. Walls, streets, and fields could stand for centuries, but without people, they quickly fell into ruin. The abandonment of towns and villages was more than a practical effect of the plague. It was a symbol of its power. It showed that even the most enduring communities could vanish in a moment, leaving only silence where there had once been life. When the Black Death loosened its grip, and the great tide of death began to ebb, what remained across Europe was not only loss but an immense and often unbearable loneliness. Survivors found themselves in landscapes where silence had replaced conversation, where empty houses outnumbered occupied ones, and where familiar faces were suddenly gone. The plague had struck quickly and with relentless force, sweeping away families, neighbors, and whole communities, and those left alive carried the heavy burden of being among the few who remained. Their loneliness was not only a personal sorrow, but a collective condition that spread through towns and villages, shaping the emotional landscape of the late medieval world. For many, loneliness began at home. Families that had once gathered around a single hearth were often reduced to one, or to survivors, a mother might find herself alone in a house once filled with children's voices. A farmer might continue his work in fields that had been shared with brothers, uncles, and neighbors, now gone. The absence was constant, pressing in from every corner of the home and every ridge of the land. Each room, each toy, each empty bed became a reminder of those who no longer lived. Survivors carried on the routines of life, but they did so surrounded by the echoes of the dead. The hearth still gave warmth, but it no longer gave comfort. In villages, the loneliness took on a communal form. Paths once busy with footsteps grew quiet, and the commons that had hosted gatherings stood empty, where once the ringing of a hammer or the voices of women spinning wool had filled the air. Silence reigned. Survivors walked through these spaces with a sense of unreality, as though the world itself had become hollow. Even when they met other villagers, the exchanges were subdued. Laughter was rare, and words often trailed off into quiet. as if no one wished to speak too loudly. The world so empty. In towns and cities, loneliness was amplified by scale. Streets built for thousands now held only hundreds. Marketplaces, designed for crowds, saw only a handful of buyers. Entire neighborhoods stood deserted, their doors closed, their shutters falling into disrepair. Survivors who ventured through these districts felt the weight of absence more sharply than ever. It was not just that people were gone, it was that the spaces built for them still remained mute and useless. The emptiness of large towns carried a ghostly quality, as if every silent street remembered the lives that had once animated it. The loneliness was also emotional, marked by the absence of relationships that had once defined identity. Medieval life was deeply communal, with people's sense of self shaped by kinship, neighbors, guilds, and parish. The plague severed these ties. Survivors often found themselves without parents, siblings, spouses, or children. A man might look around and realize that no one remained who remembered his childhood. A woman might continue her craft, but without the fellow workers who had once shared her labor. Even when strangers and newcomers filled some of these gaps, they did not replace the intimacy of bonds that had been lost. Loneliness was sharpened by memory, the sense that the world had once been full of familiar faces and voices, now forever absent. Survivors often carried guilt alongside their loneliness. Chroniclers described people asking why they had been spared, when so many others had not. The randomness of survival weighed heavily. One household might remain untouched, while the one next door lost every member. Those who lived sometimes felt burdened by the unfairness of it, questioning their purpose. In a world so altered, this guilt deepened the loneliness, for it made connection with others difficult. To speak of survival was to remember the dead, and so many chose silence, retreating further into themselves. Work itself became a lonely task. Farmers plowed fields with no neighbor beside them. Shepherds watched over flocks without the company of fellow herders. Craftsmen who once worked in bustling shops now sat alone at benches meant for many. Even the sound of tools, once part of a collective chorus of laboring differently when heard in isolation. The rhythm of scythes in fields, the strike of hammers in forges, the chatter of markets had always been shared sounds. Now, when they echoed alone, they only emphasized the vastness of absence. The loneliness of survivors was not only emotional, but also practical. Many households lost the people whose labor had been essential to survival. A widow might find herself trying to manage both field and hearth, struggling to do the work of many hands. An orphan might attempt to tend land with no guidance, relying only on memory. The sheer difficulty of survival made the emptiness heavier. Where once communities had shared burdens, survivors often found themselves bearing them alone. The loss of cooperative labor meant that work took longer, food was scarcer, and life was harder. Each struggle reinforced the sense of isolation. Travelers described meeting survivors who lived almost like hermits in once thriving villages. A single family might occupy an entire row of houses, using abandoned tools and furniture to replace what they had lost. In some cases, people moved into the homes of the dead. But even this provided little comfort. Living among the belongings of absent neighbors only deepened the sense of loneliness, as if the walls themselves remembered voices that no longer spoke. To walk through rooms once filled with laughter or arguments and find only silence was a heavy burden, one that pressed constantly on the minds of those who lived there. Children were among the loneliest survivors. Many grew up without parents, siblings, or extended kin. Some were taken in by neighbors or distant relatives, but others wandered, seeking food and shelter where they could for them. Loneliness was a defining condition of childhood. They had few to teach them, few to comfort them, and few to share their play. Their gains were quieter, their futures uncertain. Entire generations carried the mark of this isolation, shaping their memories of youth with an emptiness that could not be filled. Loneliness also reshaped how survivors related to the world around them. Many withdrew, avoiding gatherings and preferring solitude. Others sought companionship desperately, clinging to whoever remained. Some formed new bonds quickly, marrying or joining households as a way to stave off isolation. Yet these new ties were often fragile, born of necessity, rather than deep connection. The memory of lost families and communities lingered, making it difficult to trust that new relationships would endure. Every cough, every fever, every rumor of illness could reopen the wound of fear, reminding survivors how easily ties could be severed. The landscape itself reflected the loneliness. Roads once traveled by merchants and pilgrims now lay quiet, with grass sprouting between the stones. Fields stretched wide with no workers, dotted only by grazing animals. Forest paths grew over as fewer feet passed along them. Even nature seemed to echo the emptiness. Survivors walked through these landscapes with the feeling that they were moving through a world half abandoned, where the human presence had thinned almost to vanishing. Loneliness was not only about absence, but also about memory. Survivors remembered the world as it had been full, noisy, crowded, and contrasted it constantly with the silence that now surrounded them. These memories sharpened their grief. To pass a market square that had once been full of color and sound, now quiet and empty, was to feel the weight of what had been lost. Memory kept the loneliness alive, for it reminded survivors that the emptiness was not natural but created by disaster. For many, the loneliness became a lifelong companion. Even after the plague had passed and populations began to recover, the memory of silence and absence stayed with those who had lived through it. Survivors told stories to younger generations, not only of the sickness itself, but of the emptiness that followed. They spoke of walking through silent towns, of tending fields alone, of sitting by cold hearths in houses that had once been full. These stories preserved the sense of loneliness long after the immediate crisis had ended, embedding it in the cultural memory of Europe. The loneliness of survivors was one of the deepest scars left by the Black Death. Death had taken loved ones, but survival had left people stranded in worlds that felt hollow. Their lives continued, but without the networks of connection that had given life meaning. They were left to navigate not only grief, but the heavy silence of absence. It was this loneliness, perhaps even more than the fear of death itself, that marked the true devastation of the plague. When the Black Death had passed, when its tide of mortality receded, and the silence of abandoned homes and empty churches lay heavy on the land, one of the most immediate and enduring changes could be felt not in monuments or in chronicles, but in the way people worked and how they were paid for that work. For centuries before the plague, labor in much of medieval Europe had been bound within systems of obligation, serfs tied to their lords' estates, tenants owing rents and services, craftsmen organized into guilds, wages kept modest by custom and authority. The world had been stable in its hierarchies, predictable in its patterns of toil and payment. But when death cut the population in half or more in many regions, stability itself was shaken, and suddenly the most ordinary aspects of life, plowing, reaping, spinning, milling, Building were transformed by the new scarcity of hands to do them. Fields that had once required whole families and groups of neighbors to tend them now stood waiting for far fewer workers. Villages that had once overflowed with people found themselves reduced to a handful of survivors. The immediate effect of this was that labor became rare, and in the medieval economy, rarity brought value. Where once a peasant might have had little choice but to work for his lord at customary rates, now he found that his work was urgently needed and urgently sought. Landowners, desperate to have their fields tilled, their crops harvested, their animals tended, were willing to offer more than they ever had before. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Survivors discovered that they could bargain in ways their parents and grandparents never could have imagined. A farmer might refuse one lord's offer of employment in favor of another's, choosing not out of loyalty but out of advantage. Builder might travel farther than before, seeking towns where wages were higher because rebuilding after the plague demanded new houses, barns, and walls. Even ordinary gay laborers found themselves with greater leverage, able to ask for coin instead of food or for more generous portions of both. This shift unsettled the old order. Lords and wealthy landowners, who had long relied upon the abundance of peasants to keep wages low and to ensure obedience, now found themselves forced into negotiations. Some responded by offering higher payments willingly, recognizing that survival demanded flexibility. Others attempted to resist, insisting on the old customs and obligations, and finding to their dismay that workers might simply walk away. Entire estates sometimes fell into neglect when laborers refused to accept unfair terms, preferring instead to sell their work elsewhere or to cultivate small plots of abandoned land for themselves. In many regions, governments attempted to intervene, alarmed by the sudden rise in wages and the decline in obedience. Kings and councils issued ordinances to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to bind laborers to their lords, as before. The most famous of these was the English Statute of Labours in 1351, which declared that no man or woman should take more in wages than they had before the pestilence, and that all able-bodied people must accept work if offered. Yet laws, no matter how stern, could not erase the reality of scarcity. Even with penalties in place, landowners often had little choice but to pay more, for otherwise their fields would go unworked. Enforcement was uneven, and the laws vary. Existence revealed how deeply unsettled the old patterns had become. The plague also disrupted the systems of apprenticeship and guild labor in towns. With many skilled craftsmen dead, survivors found themselves in high demand. A nation who once labored under a master might now find himself courted by several employers. An apprentice might be offered full wages sooner than expected, as guilds sought to fill gaps in their ranks. In some cases, widows of craftsmen took on new prominence, continuing their husbands' work or managing workshops in ways rarely permitted before. The scarcity of skilled hands loosened the rigid structures of trade, and with it, the rigid limits on wages. For peasants, the change in work and wages was especially dramatic. Many found opportunities to improve their condition in ways that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Land and lands could be claimed, sometimes with little resistance, for there were not enough people to enforce old boundaries. Lords, desperate to keep tenants, might offer better terms, lower rents, longer leases, or even outright freedom from old obligations. The chance to negotiate, to move, or to claim land gave peasants a new sense of agency. For the first time, In generations, the balance of power between lord and laborer shifted noticeably, even if unevenly and temporarily. Not all outcomes were positive, however. The scarcity of labor sometimes led to exhaustion, as survivors found themselves pressed to do more than ever before. Fields still needed plowing, harvests still needed gathering, animals still needed tending, and with half the workers gone, the burden fell heavily on those who remained. Wages might rise, but so too did the demands of work. A single plowman might find himself working fields once handled by several, while shepherds tended flocks almost too large for them alone. The abundance of work created opportunity, but it also created new strains, and loneliness deepened the difficulty as the absence of fellow workers made every task heavier. The economic transformation was not only personal but structural. Whole regions experienced shifts in wealth and productivity. Towns that retained enough laborers prospered, rebuilding quickly and attracting migrants from depopulated villages. Villages that lost too many workers sometimes vanished altogether, their lands absorbed by neighbors or reverting to forest. The pattern of settlement changed, guided by the availability of hands to work and the willingness of survivors to stay. Wages, once stable across decades, now fluctuated by region and season, creating a new sense of uncertainty but also possibility. The rise in wages also began to alter social expectations. Peasants who earned more could afford better food, better clothing, or even small luxuries. This visible change unsettled the higher classes, who saw in it a threat to the old hierarchies. Chroniclers of the time often complained that servants and laborers dressed above their station, wearing fine cloth that once would have been reserved for wealthier folk. The lines that had once separated classes seemed blurred, and resentment followed. Attempts were made to regulate clothing through sumptuary laws, dictating what people of different ranks could wear, but these efforts, like wage controls, often failed in practice. Over time, the shift in work and wages contributed to deeper transformations in society. The decline of serfdom in many regions, the weakening of feudal bonds, the rise of a more mobile labor force all were accelerated by the conditions created in the aftermath of the plague. Though not immediate or universal, the trend was clear. The old world of tightly bound obligations gave way to a more fluid world where work could be bargained, wages demanded, and opportunities seized. Survivors, hardened by loss and empowered by necessity, carried with them the memory of a time when the balance of power shifted, and they did not forget it easily. The loneliness of survivors, described in the years just after the plague, was matched by this newfound bargaining power. Work was no longer merely survival but leverage. Wages were no longer simply dictated from above but shaped by negotiation. The Black Death had shattered communities, but in doing so, it had also opened space for new possibilities in how people lived and worked. For every abandoned field, there was also a worker who could now choose differently. For every vanished village, there was another that survived by offering better terms to its people. The scarcity of hands redefined the value of those who remained. And though the path was uneven and fraught, it marked a turning point in the long story of medieval labor. When the Black Death spread across Europe with terrifying speed, leaving in its wake the silence of emptied homes, the collapse of communities, and the grief of countless burials, it also left behind a hunger for explanation. In a world without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, people sought reasons in whatever forms they could imagine. Some blamed the air, heavy with foul smells. Others looked to the stars, claiming that the alignment of planets had poisoned the earth. Many accepted the idea that bad winds carried death. Yet beyond these vague and impersonal causes, there was always the human tendency to search for someone to blame. In that desperate search, scapegoats were chosen, and persecution followed, often with terrible violence. The plague was not only a biological disaster but also a social one, and the fear it spread was often turned against the vulnerable, the different, and the misunderstood. Scapegoating emerged first in whispers, when entire families perished in a matter of days. Survivors asked why. Why had their household fallen while another still lived? Why had one town been struck harder than the next? The plague's randomness was intolerable to minds seeking order. To suggest that human malice might be responsible gave a kind of grim sense of control. If someone had caused this, then perhaps it could be stopped. Rumors spread quickly in communities already frayed by loss. Murmurs in the market became accusations. In the square, the fact that the plague came suddenly and invisibly only heightened suspicion, for what could not be seen must surely be the work of hidden enemies. One of the most common accusations fell upon strangers, outsiders who happened to be passing through towns. A beggar with a different accent, a traveler who asked many questions, a merchant whose goods seemed unusual, all could be cast as suspicious. Strangers were easy to blame, for they had no local ties, and their absence would not wound the fabric of the community further. Violence against travelers grew in some regions. As fear made hospitality fade, inns closed their doors, and merchants hesitated to continue their routes. The loneliness of the plague was made deeper by the mistrust it bred, but far more tragically, entire groups became the targets of persecution. Among these, Jewish communities across Europe suffered the most horrific consequences. In many places, they were accused of poisoning wells, of spreading powders and poisons that supposedly brought the plague. The charge was absurd, yet it gave frightened populations a human enemy to blame. Rumors of plots circulated widely, often accompanied by tales of confessions extracted under torture. In towns from the Rhineland to Spain, Jewish populations faced mobs, expulsions, and massacres. Whole communities that had lived in Europe for centuries were destroyed within a matter of weeks or months. As survivors of these persecutions fled wherever they could, carrying with them both grief and fear. Chroniclers recorded scenes of terrible cruelty. In some towns, Jewish families were rounded up and burned alive in their houses or in specially constructed wooden enclosures. In others, individuals were executed in public squares to the applause of terrified crowds. These actions were often supported by local authorities, who either shared the suspicions or feared opposing the will of the frightened masses. Even where rulers attempted to protect Jewish subjects, pressure from the populace often overcame restraint. The plague created a climate in which long-standing prejudices erupted into violence, and the devastation of disease was compounded by the devastation of persecution. Yet Jews were not the only scapegoats. Lepers, who already lived on the margins of society, were sometimes accused of spreading the plague deliberately because their skin bore marks of illness. They became easy symbols of corruption and disease. Some were killed, others driven from their shelters, forced into further isolation and suffering. Similarly, beggars, foreigners, and even local minorities could find themselves accused, harassed, or expelled. In many ways, the plague magnified the divisions that already existed in society. The vulnerable became more vulnerable still, and suspicion spread like a second disease. Persecution did not always take violent forms, but even suspicion was corrosive. Communities that had once tolerated difference became brittle and harsh. Friendship between neighbors could falter if one was marked as strange or suspect. Bonds of trust, already strained by fear of contagion, broke entirely when accusations arose. For survivors, the memory of the plague was not only of sickness, but of betrayal, of seeing neighbors turn against one another, of witnessing violence born of fear. The persecution was uneven across Europe. In some towns, authorities intervened to stop violence, recognizing that blaming minorities would do nothing to halt the plague. In others, rulers used the chaos to seize property or to tighten their control, taking advantage of fear to justify harsh measures. The outcomes depended on local politics as much as on local fears, yet the overall pattern was clear. The plague created conditions in which the search for scapegoats flourished, and countless innocents paid the price. What drove this need for scapegoats was not only ignorance, but also the psychological weight of survival. To live amid so much death demanded explanation. To believe that the plague was purely random was unbearable, for it meant that no action, no prayer, no precaution could make one safer. Blaming others gave at least the illusion of understanding, and with understanding, the illusion of control. If wells were poisoned, they could be guarded. If outsiders were bringing powders, they could be expelled. If minorities were plotting, they could be punished. These were cruel fictions, but they gave frightened minds something to hold onto in the face of incomprehensible. The persecution also reveals how fragile social bonds had always been. Communities that appeared strong before the plague often fractured under its pressure. Prejudices that had lain dormant came to the surface, given life by fear. Where tolerance had existed, it proved thin, easily swept away. The plague exposed not only the vulnerability of bodies, but the vulnerability of human relationships, these with which trust could be replaced by suspicion and community by violence. In the longer memory of Europe, these persecutions left deep scars. Survivors of Jewish communities told their children of the massacres, preserving stories of betrayal and cruelty. Other marginalized groups remembered how quickly they had been cast aside or attacked. The memory of these events lingered for centuries, shaping how communities saw one another, shaping patterns of migration and settlement, shaping the very geography of Europe's minority populations. The scapegoating during the Black Death was not unique in history, but it was magnified by the scale of the disaster. It showed how, in times of great crisis, fear can be as deadly as disease. Bodies were claimed by the plague, but trust, tolerance, and compassion were often claimed by suspicion and violence. The survivors were left not only with the loneliness of empty houses and fields, but also with the memory of neighbors turned enemies, of communities torn apart not only by death but by hatred. In the years when the Black Death swept through Europe, survival was not only a matter of health but of constant awareness, routine, and daily fear. To wake each morning was to face a world where the ordinary had been turned upside down. Fear itself became a companion, present in every gesture, every interaction, every step beyond the threshold of the home. People lived not with the certainty of death, for no one could know their fate, but with its shadow pressing close, shaping even the smallest details of daily life. What emerged in those years was a landscape of ritual, of habits formed under pressure, of small actions meant to guard against the unseen terror. These rituals of survival, though often ineffective against the true cause of the plague, gave people a way to endure the endless fear that surrounded them. The first and most constant fear was proximity to others. The plague moved swiftly through households, and to share space was to share danger. Families that had once gathered together in warmth and closeness began to scatter within their own homes. In some cases, relatives refused to eat at the same table or sleep in the same room. Parents feared contact with their children, children with their parents. The fear of touch, of breath, of closeness itself became overwhelming. Neighbors who once greeted one another warmly at doors or in fields now averted their eyes and stepped aside. Villages that had thrived on community became landscapes of distance, where even familiar faces were approached with hesitation. Markets and towns, once vibrant with crowds and noise, became places of dread. Yet survival still demanded that people visit them, for food and supplies could not be conjured at home. To enter a marketplace was to enter a space heavy with anxiety. Buyers hurried, avoiding contact, avoiding conversation. Sellers stood farther back, shouting their offers rather than approaching customers. Coins were sometimes left on the ground or placed in bowls of vinegar before being exchanged. In the hope that cleansing might remove whatever invisible poison carried the plague, fear hovered over every transaction, yet life required that they continue. The air itself was seen as dangerous. Many believed that the plague was carried by foul smells, and so rituals of scent filled daily life. People carried flowers, herbs, or cloth soaked in vinegar, pressing them to their faces when walking through streets. Fires were lit indoors, not only for warmth but for smoke, which was thought to cleanse the air. Some carried small spheres of aromatic substances hung from belts, a constant shield against the corruption of the atmosphere. The act of smelling became a ritual of defense, a way of convincing oneself that the poison could be held at bay. Travel was shaped by fear as well. To move from one place to another was to risk entering an infected area or bringing infection home. Villages sometimes set guards at their edges, refusing entry to strangers. Travelers might find themselves turned back, no matter their need. Roads grew quieter, inns emptier, yet those who had to travel carried with them their own rituals, washing their hands in vinegar upon arrival, burning herbs in their rooms, avoiding any bedding not their own. These small acts gave a sense of protection, though they did little against the true nature of the disease. Inside homes, rituals grew around cleanliness, though not in the modern sense. People washed their hands and faces more frequently in herbs or vinegar. Clothes were shaken out, aired, sometimes even smoked over fires to drive away imagined poisons. Windows were opened to allow the air to circulate, or closed tightly to keep it out, depending on which belief held sway in a particular household. Each act was small, repetitive, and often contradictory, but each carried the weight of hope that something, anything, might prevent death from entering. Burials created their own rituals of survival, for to handle the dead was to risk one's own life. Families sometimes abandoned the task altogether, leaving it to those hired or forced into the work. Yet where families did participate, they did so with great caution. Corpses might be wrapped quickly, carried swiftly, and buried with minimal ceremony. Earth was shoveled hastily, words spoken briefly. Survivors often washed themselves afterward in strong-smelling waters, convinced this might remove contamination. These hurried rituals reflected both grief and fear, for the dead were mourned but also dreaded. Prayer and religious practices also became daily rituals, though the forms varied widely. Some gathered in processions, believing collective supplication could drive away the plague. Others withdrew entirely, convinced that gatherings themselves only spread it further. Families prayed together in hushed tones, repeating the same words day after day, hoping for protection. Bells rang from churches with greater frequency, not only to mark death but to call for intercession. Even those who had not been especially devout before often turned to prayer, not always from faith but from fear and the human need to act. In many places, people created charms, amulets, or written texts believed to hold protective power. Words were written on slips of parchment and carried in pouches. Crosses or symbols were carved into doorways. Birds were hung over beds or salt scattered across thresholds. These rituals, though small, gave people something tangible to cling to sleep at night beside a charm, to wake and repeat a prayer, to step over salt on the floor. All of these gave form to hope, even if their power was only imagined. The repetition of daily routines also became a kind of ritual of survival. To keep milking cows, to keep spinning wool, to keep baking bread, these ordinary acts took on extraordinary weight. Each gesture of normalcy was a statement that life could continue, however precariously. Survivors clung to routines as a way of resisting despair. The act of tending a field or preparing a meal became not only labor but a defense against fear, a reminder that the world, though broken, still required and allowed continuity. Fear also reshaped how people moved through space. Some avoided entire neighborhoods, convinced that death lingered in certain streets. Others refused to touch walls, doors, or objects handled by others. Children were warned not to play in certain places, not to touch the ground in certain spots. Fear mapped itself onto the physical landscape, turning ordinary spaces into zones of danger. Villages became patchworks of forbidden places. Houses became clusters of avoided rooms. Towns became landscapes of invisible boundaries marked by rumor and suspicion. Rituals of speech emerged as well. Conversations grew shorter, often filled with repeated phrases of warning or reassurance. Words of greeting might be replaced by reminders to stay safe, to keep distance, to burn herbs. Language itself reflected fear, narrowed to a few recurring themes. In this way, even talking became ritualized, shaped by the need to control what could not truly be controlled. Over time, these rituals became habitual, second nature. Survivors performed them automatically, barely questioning their meaning. To press herbs to the nose, to wash hands in vinegar, to avoid certain streets, these became woven into the fabric of life. They did not prevent the plague, but they gave shape to existence in an age when nothing felt secure. The rituals offered not only a sense of protection, but also a rhythm, a way to mark time, and to distinguish one day from another in a world otherwise blurred by loss and fear. Even after the worst years of the plague, many of these rituals lingered. Survivors carried them into later life, repeating them in times of illness or uncertainty. Families passed down practices, washing burning herbs, hanging charms, not because they worked but because they had once given comfort. In this way, the everyday fear of the plague lived on in memory, embedded in the smallest gestures of daily life long after the pestilence itself had receded. The story of the Black Death is often told in numbers, in the scale of its death toll and the speed of its spread. Yet to understand it fully, one must also look at these small, daily rituals of survival. For in them, we see how ordinary people endured the extraordinary, how they met fear not with grand strategies, but with countless small acts. Each herb carried, each prayer whispered, each coin dropped into vinegar was a thread in the fragile fabric of survival. The rituals did not save them from death, but they gave them the strength to live each day in its shadow. The sound of a medieval town was once a constant murmur of life, horses' hooves striking cobblestones, merchants shouting their prices in crowded squares, the cries of children weaving between stalls, the clang of blacksmiths at their forges, and the tolling of church bells marking the rhythm of days. All of these noises blended into a steady music that defined the streets of cities and villages alike. But when the Black Death came, that music stopped, the streets emptied, and what had been the lively veins of daily life fell silent. The emptiness of those streets was itself a presence, a haunting weight that survivors remembered long after the plague had passed out. At first, the emptiness came gradually, almost unnoticed. One market stall remained vacant, its cloth awning rolled up, its goods absent. A familiar doorway stayed shut for a day or two longer than usual. A house that once filled the air with the smell of baking bread gave off nothing but silence. But then the absence grew. Entire rows of stalls in the market stood empty. Inns closed their doors, shutters nailed across windows. The smith's hammer no longer rang out. The sound replaced by stillness. With each week, another sound fell away, another voice disappeared, until the streets themselves seemed to hold their breath. For those who walked them, the emptiness was overwhelming. A journey that once took twice as long because of the bustle of neighbors now carried a person through silence. Shoes echoed unnaturally on stone, the sound bouncing between walls with no voices to muffle it. Where once greetings were exchanged at every corner, there was no one to meet. Even animals seemed fewer. Stray dogs lingered near deserted homes, and birds circled above. But the clatter and chatter of human life was gone. Survivors often described the streets as if they belonged to the dead more than the living. The emptiness was not only sound but also sight. Streets filled with shuttered windows looked blind, like rows of eyes closed in eternal sleep. Grass began to grow between cobblestones where feet no longer pressed it down. In places, carts left abandoned stood where their drivers had fallen, sick, their wheels rotting, their loads untouched. In some towns, fires burned in the streets. Piles of belongings or clothing set alight in the hope of cleansing infection. The smoke curled over empty squares where no crowds gathered to watch. The sight of emptiness became as terrible as the plague itself, for it revealed the scale of absence. At night, the emptiness grew heavier still. Darkness had always been familiar to medieval towns, for only candles and torches lit the streets. But even those small lights disappeared, with so few people left to tend them. Public lamps went unlit, and windows remained dark. Streets that once glowed faintly with scattered lights became black corridors, broken only by the pale gleam of the moon. To walk them was to feel utterly alone, the silence deepened by the weight of shadows. Survivors later recalled that even the wind seemed louder, whistling through empty alleys where once laughter or quarrels had filled the air. The emptiness of the streets was also an emptiness of purpose. Markets that had once been the heart of economic life ceased to function. Bakers had no customers, weavers no buyers, brewers no one to drink their ale. The absence of trade turned towns into hollow shells. Villages fared no better, with their commons unused, their paths untrodden. To walk through such spaces was to feel that life itself had been suspended, waiting for voices that would never return. The economy of daily life was undone, not only by death but by the silence of its absence. Yet even in emptiness, there were traces of the living. Sometimes a single figure crossed a deserted square, moving quickly head lowered, as if pursued by the silence. A lone cart rolled by, its driver covering his face, carrying goods to a household that dared not step outside. Children occasionally peered from windows, their eyes wide, watching the emptiness as though it were itself a threat. These small signs of life seemed almost spectral, fleeting glimpses in a landscape that otherwise belonged to absence. The emptiness also carried fear. Streets without people felt unsafe, for it was not only the plague that threatened, but the possibility of crime. With fewer eyes to watch, fewer neighbors to notice, theft and violence could pass unseen. Survivors feared robbers as much as sickness, and so many stayed indoors, reinforcing the emptiness by their absence. The mistrust that the plague fostered extended to space itself, as if the streets themselves had become hostile. To walk them was an act of necessity, not of choice. Over time, the emptiness became familiar, though never comfortable. Survivors adjusted to silence, learned to navigate streets without crowds, learned to bear the sight of boarded windows and closed doors. Yet even as it became routine, it weighed on them. The memory of what had been the bustling, noisy, vibrant life of towns made the silence sharper. Each empty street was a reminder not only of those who had died, but of the community that had been lost. Survivors did not simply mourn individuals. They mourned the life of the street itself. When the plague eventually receded, the emptiness lingered. Not every house reopened, for many had no survivors. Not every stall returned to the market, for many families were gone. Some towns never regained their former bustle, their streets permanently quieter. Others rebuilt slowly, but the memory of emptiness clung to them. Even when life returned, survivors carried within them the recollection of what silence had once filled those spaces. To hear laughter again was to remember the silence that had replaced it. To see a crowd was to remember the empty square. The empty streets of the plague years became symbols of the fragility of community. They showed how quickly life could be undone, how swiftly sound and movement could be erased. They revealed the dependence of human beings on one another, for streets are not simply stones and buildings, but the life that fills them. Without people, they became hollow, eerie, almost unrecognizable. Survivors learned that the street itself could die as surely as the people within it. Long afterward, chroniclers and poets described the emptiness of the streets with a shiver of memory. For them, the silence of those years stood as one of the clearest images of the plague. Death could not be seen directly, but its presence was written in the absence of sound, of sight, of community. The empty streets were the plague's signature, a visible reminder of its invisible force. To recall them was to recall fear, grief, and loneliness, all bound up in the silence of abandoned towns. And so the memory of the Black Death was not only of sickness and burial, but also of emptiness. Streets where footsteps echoed alone, where shutters stayed closed, where the music of daily life was silenced. That emptiness told its own story, one of absence and loss, one of a world paused and waiting, one of survivors walking through silence with the weight of grief pressing down. It was a story not only of what the plague destroyed, but of how its survivors remembered, carrying the image of those empty streets with them for the rest of their lives. The Black Death did not only steal lives, it also unraveled the threads that bound families together. In medieval Europe, the family was the foundation of survival, the core on which daily labor, food, and comfort were organized. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes distant relatives all lived closely, bound by necessity as much as affection. When the plague arrived, it entered these households with ruthless force, scattering their members in death and in fear of leaving behind a loneliness that cut more deeply than hunger or cold. To survive the plague was often to survive without those who had once given meaning to life, and that survival was haunted by absence. In the earliest days of the outbreak, many families tried desperately to remain together. A household would retreat behind closed doors, shuttering windows, and locking gates in the hope that isolation might protect them. Parents gathered their children, telling them to stay inside, away from neighbors and markets. Meals were shared quietly, prayers whispered together. There was comfort in numbers, in being surrounded by familiar faces. Yet this closeness was precisely what made families so vulnerable. When one member fell sick, the others soon followed. A cough in the night, a swelling on the neck or under the arm, a sudden fever, these were signs that spread panic within households. Mothers who had once cared tenderly for children now feared to touch them, and children recoiled from parents who began to show signs of illness. The very intimacy that defined families turned into a channel for disease. As the plague deepened, some families were broken not only by death but by abandonment. Chroniclers record that in their terror, some husbands left their wives, wives their husbands, parents their children. Not all did so, but enough that it left a lasting mark on memory. The fear of contagion overwhelmed bonds that had seemed unbreakable. Neighbors whispered of households where sick children were left alone in their beds, where elderly parents died without care. It was not always cruelty but desperation, a survival instinct so strong that it drowned out love. Yet for those abandoned, the loneliness was immeasurable, a final cruelty before death. Even when families stayed together, they endured a loneliness born of grief. A father might bury a son in the morning, only to bury a daughter in the evening. A widow might sit in a silent house that once rang with laughter, surrounded only by the memory of voices that no longer spoke. Survivors carried the burden of seeing familiar faces vanish one by one, until they were the only ones left at the table, the only ones walking through rooms once full of life. The silence of an emptied family was as heavy as the silence of an emptied street. For children, the loneliness was sharper still. Orphans multiplied as the plague raged, their small figures wandering through villages, seeking food, seeking shelter. Some were taken in by relatives, others by neighbors, but many were left to fend for themselves. Chroniclers speak of children crying at doorsteps, of tiny hands clutching at strangers who turned away in fear. The medieval world was not equipped with institutions to care for such numbers of orphans, and so many simply disappeared, uncounted among the millions dead. For those who survived, the memory of loneliness in childhood shaped their entire lives thereafter, leaving scars that outlived the plague itself. The loneliness of the plague was not only the loneliness of individuals, but of families as social units. Weddings ceased, for no one dared to gather for celebration. Births dwindled, for fewer children were conceived in years of fear. Family gatherings, feasts, and the extended ties of kinship that once strengthened villages weakened or vanished altogether. The networks that made up the broader fabric of family life were frayed, leaving survivors to feel not only personal loss, but the loss of their place within larger family circles. To live through the plague was often to live without aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, to find oneself the last thread of a once vast tapestry. Loneliness also crept into the very spaces of family homes. Rooms once shared by siblings became empty, beds unused, clothing left behind like ghosts of those who had worn them. Kitchens no longer filled with the noise of children waiting for bread. Courtyards no longer echoed with family voices. Survivors often reported feeling haunted by these absences, as though the walls themselves remembered and grieved. The house that had once been a shelter became instead a reminder of loss, its silence amplifying the loneliness of those left behind. And yet, amid this devastation, some families clung more fiercely to one another. Survivors tell of parents who refused to abandon sick children, of spouses who cared for one another despite the risk, of siblings who shared what little they had. These stories, though fewer, remind us that love endured even in the face of death. But even for them, loneliness came when the inevitable occurred. Those who survived after such devotion often lived with the grief of having stayed only to see the ones they cherished taken away. Their survival was shadowed by the loneliness of memory. The psychological toll of this loneliness cannot be overstated. Humans are social beings, and in medieval Europe, the family was the center of identity. To lose that was to lose not only companionship but the very sense of self. Survivors often describe themselves as alone in the world, a phrase that captured not just solitude but a deep loss of belonging. The plague left behind countless such individuals alive in body but profoundly isolated. In the long aftermath, loneliness shaped the rebuilding of communities. Families had to be reformed from fragments. Widows and widowers remarried, not always from love but from necessity. Orphans were absorbed into new households. Surviving relatives sought one another out, clinging to whatever kinship remained. Slowly, new family structures emerged, but they were built on the ruins of old ones, and the memory of what had been lost remained. Loneliness did not vanish with the plague. It lingered in the stories told by survivors, in the silences at family tables, in the absence of names in family roles. Thus, the story of the Black Death is not only one of mass death and empty streets, but also one of broken families, and the loneliness that followed. To survive the plague was to live in a quieter, emptier world, where voices once familiar had fallen silent and faces once dear were gone. The loneliness endured as much as the grief, a companion as constant as fear, shaping the lives of those who remained long after the plague itself had passed. When the great wave of the Black Death had at last begun to ebb, those who remained alive looked out upon a world forever altered. It was not simply that so many had died, though the absence of faces once familiar was everywhere felt. It was also that the structures of daily life, the rhythms of labor and worship, the expectations of community and family had all been shaken loose. The survivors lived in a quieter, thinner world, one in which every step carried the weight of memory. To walk through a street was to see emptiness where neighbors had once lived. To sit at a table was to glance at the chairs where loved ones no longer sat. Yet despite the grief, life pressed forward, and the survivors began to shape a new world. Out of the ruins, the survivors' world was first of all a world of space. With so many gone, fields lay untended, houses stood abandoned, and villages shrank. For those who remained, there was suddenly more land, more property, more room than ever before. In earlier years, peasants had crowded into small plots, eking out a living under the watchful eye of lords, pressed by population into scarcity. But now the scarcity was of people, not land. A single family might find itself cultivating acres once shared among many, or living in a house larger than any they had known before. The abundance of space was both opportunity and burden, offered new chances for prosperity, but it also carried the eerie reminder of why such space was available, because so many others were gone. Economically, the survivors' world was reshaped by labor. Where once peasants had been bound by obligation to lords, Their labor cheap because so many competed for survival. Now their work became valuable, with fields unplowed and herds untended. Lords had no choice but to pay higher wages, to offer better conditions, to attract the dwindling supply of workers. Laborers gained new power. Peasants found themselves able to negotiate, and in some cases, entire villages refused to accept old burdens. The survivors, who had once borne the heaviest weights of medieval society, discovered a new measure of freedom. Yet this freedom was shadowed by sorrow, for it was bought with the deaths of neighbors and kin. The survivors' world was also one of shifting social order, with noble families extinguished, their lines broken by death, lands and titles passed unexpectedly to distant heirs or fell into disarray. Clergy, too, had been decimated, leaving parishes without priests, monasteries without monks. Authority faltered in places, and survivors had to navigate a landscape where the old hierarchies no longer held as firmly as before. Some found themselves rising in status, inheriting lands or positions they would never have reached otherwise. Others found themselves without guidance, without the structures that had once shaped every aspect of life. The survivors lived in a world where the familiar had collapsed, and they had to invent new ways to order their communities. Grief, however, remained the most constant element of the survivors' world. Every face carried the shadow of loss. Widows and widowers were countless, orphans unnumbered. Even those who had gained new land or wealth did so with sorrow close behind them. To sow a field was to remember the hands that had once helped. To sleep in a bed was to recall who had once shared it. Survivors often described themselves as living among ghosts, for the memory of the dead was everywhere. Villages seemed haunted, not by spirits but by absence, and every new day was measured against the weight of what had been lost. Daily life itself bore marks of survival, routines that had once seemed ordinary: baking bread, tending animals, fetching water were now performed in a world where their familiar partners were missing. People moved more slowly, more cautiously, with a sense of fragility. Yet they also clung more tightly to these routines, for in them lay a promise that life continued. A loaf of bread was no longer just food, but a sign that something endured. A plowed field was a declaration that the world had not ended, though it had been broken. In this way, survival was not only physical but symbolic. Every act a gesture of persistence against despair. The survivor's world was one of memory. People told stories of those who had died, repeating names so that they would not be forgotten. Children learned of siblings they had lost before they could remember. Their lives carried on in tales and whispers. Entire communities kept alive the memory of the plague years, shaping them into warnings, into lessons, into shared identity. The Black Death became not only a tragedy but a marker in time. There was life before the pestilence, and life after. Survivors measured their days by this division, always conscious of having lived through something that had remade the world. Fear lingered, too, even after the plague had receded. Survivors watched for signs of its return, flinched at every fever, every unexplained death. The rituals of survival herbs, prayers, amulets remained in place, less from belief in their power than from habit born of terror. Communities carried a collective memory of vulnerability, a sense that death could sweep upon them again at any moment. This fear shaped behavior, making survivors cautious, sometimes suspicious, sometimes withdrawn. It was as if the world had been permanently shadowed, even in times of recovery. Yet alongside fear and grief, there was resilience. Survivors learned to adapt, to rebuild, to use the opportunities the New World offered. Villages reorganized their fields, towns reopened their markets, families reformed through new marriages and adoptions. Slowly, the rhythms of life returned. Though altered, children were born, laughter returned to some streets, songs to some gatherings. Survivors carried grief, but they also carried determination. They had seen the worst, and yet they remained. In this, they discovered a strength they might not have known otherwise, a capacity to endure that became part of their identity. The survivor's world was thus a paradox, emptier yet more spacious, poorer yet richer, fearful yet resilient. It was a world haunted by absence but alive with new possibilities. Every survivor lived with contradictions, grieving yet grateful, afraid yet hopeful, diminished yet empowered. The plague had stripped life to its barest core, and those who remained had to weave new cloth from torn threads. Their world was neither the same as before nor wholly alien, but something in between, a landscape of loss and of renewal. In the centuries that followed, the survivor's world became the foundation for new changes in Europe. The shift in labor relations, the weakening of feudal structures, the rise of new social mobility, all of these grew out of the conditions shaped by survival. But at the heart of it was not politics or economics, but the lived experience of ordinary people who had endured the silence, the emptiness, the fear, and the loneliness. Their world was built from memory, from the determination to continue even when so much had been lost. And so, when we speak of the Black Death, we speak not only of death itself, but of the survivor's world, the world that rose from ashes, shaped by grief yet carrying the fragile thread of life forward. For in the end, survival was not only about continuing to breathe, but about continuing to live, to find meaning in the face of loss, and to shape a future from the ruins of the past. When the plague years had finally loosened their grip, and the survivors began to measure life in something more than fear, the question that lingered was what lessons could be drawn from such devastation. Medieval Europe was not a world of rapid scientific progress or widespread literacy, but people still sought meaning in catastrophe. They looked for explanations in nature, in human behavior, and in the order of their societies. Out of their searching came not clear answers, but changes small, at first, then larger as generations passed, that shaped the future in ways they could not have foreseen. The lessons of the Black Death were not written neatly in books or declared in laws alone. They were etched into daily life, remembered in behavior, embedded in choices. One of the clearest lessons was about the fragility of human life. For centuries, people had lived with the expectation of death from sickness, accident, or war, but the plague magnified this reality beyond measure. Entire households were swept away in days, villages cut in half, monasteries left empty. Survivors could no longer take for granted that the structures of life, family, community, work were stable. They understood that existence was precarious, that what seemed secure today could vanish tomorrow. This awareness seeped into their decisions. Families sought to secure their holdings more carefully, drawing up wills, ensuring inheritances, and teaching children how to carry responsibilities. Communities took greater care in preserving their records, their traditions, their rights, so that they might not be lost if death came again. The lesson was that stability was not given, but had to be guarded. Another lesson was about labor and power. The plague had destroyed populations, and in doing so, it shifted the balance between those who worked and those who ruled. Survivors learned that their work had value, that without them fields went unplanted and goods unnade. Peasants demanded wages, and sometimes won them. Townsfolk refused old duties and claimed new freedoms. The lesson was not only that survival gave them leverage, but that human effort itself was the foundation of society. Lords and masters could command, but without workers, nothing could be sustained. This recognition did not end inequality, but it planted seeds that would grow into greater shifts over time. Communities also learned about the importance and the limits of health and cleanliness. Though they did not understand germs, survivors saw patterns. Disease spread where filth was greatest, where animals and humans crowded together, where air grew foul. Cities began to take more care in disposing of waste, in regulating markets, in maintaining cleaner streets. Some towns appointed officials to watch over health. The first faint outlines of what would later become public health systems. The lesson was not precise, but it was practical. If sickness could not be prevented, its spread might at least be slowed by order and vigilance. The plague also forced lessons in compassion. Though these were uneven, many had turned away from the sick, fled from family, left neighbors to die alone. Yet others had risked themselves to care for loved ones, had shown mercy to orphans, had given alms to the poor. Survivors remembered both the cruelty of abandonment and the kindness of sacrifice. In the years that followed, stories of selfless care were told alongside warnings of selfish flight. The lesson was that human behavior mattered as much as fate. In times of terror, people revealed who they were and communities remembered. These memories shaped reputations, influenced trust, and set examples for future generations. Another lesson was about resilience. When the streets had been emptied, when markets had closed and families had been broken, life seemed as though it might never return. Yet slowly, life had resumed. Fields were tilled again. Markets reopened, children were born. The survivors discovered that recovery was possible, even from devastation. This did not erase grief, but it gave a sense of endurance. The lesson was that societies could bend without breaking, that people could continue even when so much was lost. This resilience became a quiet foundation for later generations, who looked back on the plague years as proof that humanity could endure the worst. The lessons of the plague were not confined to the living alone. They were carried forward in memory, in stories, in the ways survivors taught their children. Families spoke of the years when streets were silent, when neighbors vanished, when fear filled every corner. They told these stories not only to grieve but to warn. The plague became a marker in collective memory, a way to measure time. To speak of the before and after was to acknowledge that nothing had been the same again. The lesson was that history itself could change the fabric of life, and that memory was a form of survival. In broader terms, the plague also taught societies about change. Old structures had seemed immovable before the pestilence. The authority of lords, the duties of peasants, the traditions of craft and guild, the rhythms of church and festival. But the plague showed that even the greatest structures could falter when populations collapsed. Survivors learned that society was not as fixed as it seemed, that it could be reshaped by necessity. This lesson opened space for shifts in landholding, for experiments in governance, for gradual loosening of old ties. The pace of medieval life remained slow, but beneath the surface, the understanding that things could change had taken root. Even art and culture absorbed lessons from the plague. Survivors turned to imagery of death, of transience, of the fragility of earthly things. Carvings, paintings, songs all reflected the memory of loss, yet they also expressed endurance, the persistence of beauty even in sorrow. The lesson here was that creativity did not vanish with grief but responded to it, finding new forms to express what words could not. Future generations inherited not only the memory of death but also the cultural expressions that it inspired, shaping how they thought of life and mortality. The lessons of the Black Death were not written with clarity at the time. They were scattered, and often contradictory. Some drew lessons of fear, choosing to withdraw, to isolate, to cling to suspicion. Others drew lessons of renewal, seeking freedom, reform, and resilience. What bound them together was the recognition that the plague had been a teacher, however cruel. It had revealed the fragility of human structures, the value of labor, the importance of compassion, the possibility of recovery, and the inevitability of change. For the survivors, these lessons were not abstract. They lived them each day in the choices they made, in the ways they rebuilt their families and communities. They carried them in memory, passed them in story, preserved them in practice. And for generations after, the lessons of the plague lingered, shaping the course of European history in subtle but lasting ways. Thus, when we speak of the Black Death, we speak not only of loss and grief but also of lessons, lessons written in silence and sorrow, carried forward by survivors, embedded in the foundations of the future. Lessons that remind us that even in devastation, humanity observes, remembers, and adapts. The world that emerged after the plague was not the same as before, and the lessons it carried were part of what made it new. We have now walked together through the long, shadowed years of the Black Death, step by step, chapter by chapter, from the first whispers of sickness arriving on distant ships, to the empty streets of forgotten towns, to the slow rebuilding of life in the years that followed. Along the way, we have seen not only loss and grief, but resilience, adaptation, and the quiet strength of ordinary people who endured when so much seemed impossible. The Black Death was more than an event in history. It was a turning point. It tore apart families, altered villages, and unsettled kingdoms. Yet it also reshaped the very foundations of Europe. Laborers discovered their power, communities redefined their rules. Art and culture absorbed the memory of death while celebrating life. The survivors did not merely live through those dark years. They carried their memory forward, passing it to generations who would build upon the lessons learned in silence and sorrow. As we look back now, centuries later, we see that history is never still. It is always marked by change, sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden, sometimes devastating. But even in devastation, there is continuity, for people adapt, rebuild, and carry their stories forward. The Europe that emerged from the plague was wounded but stronger, altered but enduring, haunted but hopeful. And in that paradox lies the essence of history itself. This concludes our journey through the world of the Black Death. Thank you for staying with me through these long, quiet hours of history told slowly, as if by the dim light of a fading candle. If you found peace, comfort, or reflection in this telling, I invite you to join again for the next story, another calm journey into the forgotten corners of the past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with others who might enjoy falling asleep to history. Your support helps keep these stories alive, told not with haste, but with care, so that we may continue exploring the human past together. Until next time, may your night be restful, your sleep deep, and your dreams gentle. Good night.